Hello, today is Tuesday, May 7th, 2019. This is the SIG Arch conformance subproject. Our agenda is pretty light. We did have a bunch of follow-up action items though. Before we got into that, I did have a question about Administrivia. We have KubeCon in probably 2 weeks time frame. Should we punt that meeting? Or will there be other people here to attend?
I'll be at Keep Going.
I'm fine with punting. I'll have to talk with Matt about deleting that invite. So unless there's any other dissent, I'll move to punt. Going once, twice, 3 times. All right, punt it is. So follow up on action items. Srini, first up with regards to the automation.
Yeah, actually, I have made some headway on the project plugin. Now the project plugin PR is reviewed by Steve Kuznetsov. He almost ready to LGTM that. And there are 2 more plugin related fixes for project plugin that will allow us to do move, create, and list cards. Then I will be setting up. I already pushed the PR with the existing code on the project manager plugin. I'll just have to set up the environment to start testing that. So it should be done by end of this week.
All right, that's good. So the one thing that matters the most is the auto label auto puts on the project board. Will that particular feature be done? Or if the Globin folks know how to just do the / project, that's fine too. We have to update the instructions.
Right. Yeah. The base code, if it is in for the project manager, then I'll start working on those features after that. So
I have a comment about how that might work. So I just triaged all of the SIG architecture issues that are labeled SIG architecture, which are multiple different subprojects, not just conformance. One thing that would be useful is a clear way to know if the issue already appeared on some subproject's project board. So either, there needs to be, I think, some direct, clear linkage between the labels and the project boards, whether that's by just understanding what the label query is for each board or having an explicit project label or something, because otherwise you actually have to open up the issue to see that it's on a project, or a PR to see that it's on a project board already, or you have to open up the project board. So if you're triaging in bulk, it would be useful to be able to just add easily to a project board and to see which things are already on project board somewhere.
That's what Srini's doing. There's 2 parts to that work. One part was just to add the bot automation for a person to do / project, whatever. The second one was to explicitly associate the area CNCF label with auto putting in the triage column for the project board, because that right now it's all mechanical Turk.
Area conformance, you mean?
Yeah, area conformance.
Yeah. So that would be fine.
Sounds good.
So I pinged you, Brian, specifically about following up on, I've mentioned a couple of times, there's the issue that the Globin folks are having, and they filed an issue in the sort of backlog, which is this particular one, which has come across a number of PRs. Nope, not that one, sorry.
The condition and reason and message one?
Yeah, but I'm trying to find the actual issue.
So I posted a couple of long responses on that one, okay. As well as following up on some of the issues that were referenced or PRs that were referenced. I think all of those tests mentioned are currently don't qualify for conformance. Like they are doing things that they should not be doing. That they are overly specific. They're like unit tests that are testing the implementation, not the behavior that is guaranteed to be stable and portable.
Okay. So with regards to, we should, if that's the case for some of them, I know some of them are not though.
Every test I looked at was of that nature.
Checking the individual behavior of the return response. I know that
Yes.
some of them were checking failure conditions though, for like, if you were to try and get to quota as an example, if it tried to exceed a quota, it was trying to verify that it errored out with a known error.
Well, I think that's the problem. Like they're looking for very specific error messages, and that has been broken in the past, and I think it would be valid to break it in the future. Like they should not be checking for specific error message strings. That's just wrong. And the behavior, they should guarantee that the behavior that is not supposed to happen does not happen within the time of the test.
I think what people are looking for, and myself included, is not just a statement of wrong, but why you think it's wrong, as well as like what they should do to mitigate or approach it differently to change the tests.
Yeah, so I tried to link to previous documents and explain why it's wrong and where, if you had made this assumption, it would have been broken in the past.
Mm-hmm.
For example, when we added crash loop back off and image pull back off, any test that was testing earlier specific reasons for why a container was not starting would have been broken. And as we continue to improve operational behavior, I would expect more such behavioral improvements to be added, right? So that's not a thing you can depend on. We have broken that several times, and when we run version skew tests, we run the end-to-end tests against other Kubernetes releases, and when those break, someone has to go through case by case and figure out if that breakage is acceptable, and then they have to decide, am I going to backport changes to the test in the release branch for a previous release? And that's just fraught with peril. We have broken actual compatibility in the past when people changed the tests to match new behaviors. So I would really like a blanket rule that says, no, you can't do that unless you get some ultra high level exception that says, yeah, that's a valid thing to do. You're not breaking actual API contract and changing the test to match. The test was broken. Right now, it's all too frequent that the tests are broken.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I understand where they're coming from, and I understand the approach they're taking. There's stricter guarantees that exist in other systems, and there's a very loose guarantee. There's no guarantee, I guess, in Kubernetes land, and we're making that explicit. So as long as we give that guidance,
there are guarantees, but the guarantee is not that a specific error message is going to stay the same. Like if we update all of the events to the new event style guide, literally every event message will change. Every test that depends on an event message will break.
I think that's fair that error messages and events can change. The test apparatus itself is versioned though with Kubernetes too.
Right, and I'm saying we run different versions. We run versions of the tests against different versions of releases.
Not in the wild for the conformance effort, but inside of Kubernetes, that is true.
Inside of Kubernetes, yes.
Yep. Okay, that's fair.
Yeah, so in many cases, these tests just have to relax what they are looking for, right? They actually just need to validate that the thing that's not supposed to happen doesn't happen, rather than validating that some specific error is the reason it didn't happen.
That's fair, and I think that's the guidance we should write up in particular and show as examples to them, because there are a number of tests where we have to basically push back on them and say
that. Yeah, and they're getting written as if they were unit tests, right? So I understand the test to match the implementation mindset. And in general, I think that's not an awesome mindset. It leads to a bunch of fragile tests. Every time the code changes in any way, you have to go change the test.
Yeah, that's fair. All right. So I think I can go from this issue and update the guidance with example in more detail, and then close this issue, and then run through the other issues and close them out. I did have another action item, which is the long-standing one, which was we need a rubric, which I think I may also ask you, Brian, for help on that one with regards to an understanding of how the Globin folks want to be able to proceed in absence of. There was a lot of questions. I don't know if you have a chance to look at the conversation we had last week, Thursday. There was a recording that I posted, but having like a way for them to evaluate what they should do next is helpful in absence of being able to sync with this individual group, like a individual rubric for how they want to approach things. They're right now trying to fill out pod spec behavior, and they had a bunch of questions about like what matters most. And there's a lot of conditional fields that exist inside of the pod spec. So they were trying to determine what's the best area to cover first.
Okay. So first of all, definitely covering pod spec is the right thing.
Yes.
I can go back and look at that recording if there are not much in the way of notes. Or we can discuss it now or at a future meeting, if that would help. But in the way I approached it, and at least initially, there was a lot of low-hanging fruit because you could just literally walk through the pod spec and there are fields, and if they're expected to be portable and there were no tests covering even rudimentary behaviors, then we should create some tests that cover those rudimentary behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do we have tests that cover all the different ways you can run liveness probes and readiness probes, right? There are HTTP probes and exec probes and maybe TCP probes. Do we have basic coverage of those? If we've completed like all the low-hanging fruit, then we can think about, well, are there failure mode behaviors that we care about? Or should we move on to other things like watch? And for watch, I think I would just walk through the exercise of imagining what a typical controller would do, right? So I think that we had the rudimentary test we had for watch is if I do a create, an update, a delete, do I see those events? That's super rudimentary. You need to be able to do things like if when a watch connection breaks, you need to be able to resume at the same resource version, even if there are other changes. We need to figure out what the consistency model is and test that, right? So the way I would approach it is look for broad, simple coverage first, and then once that is satisfied, go down to the next level and try to imagine what the gotchas are. They might be different in a different implementation, but still should be expected to be portable. And the same that a user writing a client could reasonably depend on in a forward compatible way. I understand that's increasing levels of subtlety. It's possible we should move on from pod spec and watch once we have simpler coverage to other things that users use that should be in every Kubernetes cluster, portable everywhere.
Yeah. That was kind of the point. Like I added watches here as the second agenda item.
That's a good thing to add, given the number of different etcd replacements.
Yeah. So just to be clear, both of these are kind of on my list of things to get to over the during this quarter, but I haven't quite gotten to them yet. So in any case, I'm planning on looking at watch before too long. But that doesn't preclude anybody else from doing the same thing.
I think what the ask is here is just a set of very simple buckets, maybe a little bit of a further breakdown of some of the bucketing of behavior below this, just so they have a rubric for evaluation. Would be helpful to them. That's the ask.
Do we have a list or a spreadsheet or anything of what's been covered so far in PodSpec?
They do have some information there. Srini, you might know more than I would.
Yeah, I can actually send out. As, yeah, we are listing out the behaviors. Actually, we are trying to figure out what other fields are missing from, but just getting to understand a field apart from the behavior is getting harder because we kind of think that we have reached a point where we don't have any more. But I can actually send out that list by tomorrow, and then we can see what is missing in terms of behavior. So that way we can probably chip in and actively add some items there. Then we can start looking at and work on those. So
That would be great. Do you know about pod networking? Which things in pod networking have been covered? Like I know when I looked before, people had claimed that even without the networking functioning, they could pass conformance. We want to make sure that if two pods get scheduled to different nodes, that they can communicate via their pod IPs.
yeah, we talked about that. Yeah, that.
Yeah, there's a similar issue with services. I just looked at the set of tests, and they're testing that the APIs look like things are working, but they don't actually test that, that things are reachable, or that that the actual, um, the actual functionality is
Yeah,
working.
I know in the past that we were able to entirely break the guestbook application and no test failed. So, having tests that cover that this core functionality of the system is actually working is definitely needed, and it's hard to tell whether we have that coverage now or not.
So as my own agenda item, this is kind of the goal of the cap that I started for listing out what those behaviors are in exquisite detail, and then we can match those to the tests rather than combing through the entire content of the test code to try and figure that out.
Okay. Why don't we? Can we add that as an agenda item for next time, which will probably be in a month now? That way we can actually walk through and give the rubric to Globant for them to evaluate.
We can also start by email. If that list of what do we have covered now is sent up by email, we can respond on that thread.
That'll work too. Can I assign you to that, John?
Yes.
So whatever the list we have built out, I'll pass it on to John. Maybe. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Next up was API Snoop. Did you want to take screen?
Sure, this is Hippie. So I can get a screen up real quick. I'll take our meeting notes over. I've lost my window. Here we go. Share. Desktop. Do. I'm afraid I can't see anything. I hit the wrong button. Pretty much on the document that we have, there's some links, and if you can force unshare for me, my Zoom client tends to break my box and so I can't control the Zoom session. If you'll, yeah, I may have to be kicked or something. Thank you for that. I'll try again. And I'm not full screen, so if I share the desktop, try again. Yeah, it's still not going to work today. And the 3 links that we see there under the are related to our conformance. During the last meeting, I sent some links, but they were to the entire coverage, and they were a lot higher. When we focus on stable, we can see that the numbers do get better as far as the total number of tested. Conformance is slowly creeping up there. We actually went down between 112 and 113. We also updated the link. Some of the other things we were looking at, it's actually down there in the board diff. I hear that we are trying to see what's different from last week and trying to track what's different on our board. In the same way that I'm working with Kate's infra team to audit the changes within our community infrastructure, I thought it might be interesting just to write something small to dump the board and do a diff so we can see what's changed. I know that's been mentioned a few times. And on the pod behavior, one of the things I'm looking at right now is going through the stable Helm charts and dumping out the generated kube cuddle YAMLs so that we can see the objects that are used there and the parameters. So we can start looking at the pod specs and what's generated from those applications to see what fields are commonly used at that level, and then progress from there to look at the stuff that is loaded by cncf.ci. There's a lot of, or several of the CNCF projects are deployed there and have audit logs that might help us to focus and see what parameters and objects are in use. And then the last thing was some new UI elements to focus on. I don't know whether to call them kind or definitions, depending on whether we're looking at it from what's passed in the API or what's referenced in the Open API spec. But it's looking at which applications and what parameters are being passed to those kinds, particularly ready to patch and update. But that's the short version. I appreciate any feedback either on those numbers or on the approach we're looking to take with maybe the board and the behavior exploration.
Any questions or comments for Hippie? Going once, twice, 3 times. Next up, discuss the KEP. John, I know that I looked at this KEP a while ago. It was basically outlining a ton of metadata, which blasted out a better description.
So, I mean, the idea is just, I think we've talked about it before, but it's to separate out the list of expected behaviors from the actual test code. Right now, they're embedded in there, and it makes it really difficult to answer the questions we were trying to answer earlier, like what coverage do we have on pod spec? It means we have to essentially dig through a lot of code to determine what that is. It also makes it so that when we're doing this test promotion or when we're creating new tests, as I see it, there's 2 different roles here. There's the role of the reviewer who can identify, whether a particular test, or rather whether a particular behavior should be subject to conformance, and then there's whether an individual test actually tests that behavior. And that, I think that 2 different types of reviewers can do that. So the idea was to try and make it easier on, I guess, the deciding on what behavior is conformant. The people who need to do that may be more bandwidth constrained than those of us looking at whether a test actually tests that conformance. So I'm trying to separate those out.
I think the idea is well intentioned. I think the adding all the metadata to all the tests will take a long time to make sure it's complete and clean.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a substantial amount of work, but I think it can be done in a way that I don't think I described this in the CAP, but it can be done in a way that is essentially allows the existing conformance testing, reporting, evaluation, all to continue because it's just labeled at that point, right? So, I mean, I guess we have to make a decision on what the criteria are to decide whether this CAP is worth doing or not. And I'd be happy to put together a prototype of some kind to move it forward and see whether that is valuable, if that's a useful next step. But I think that, if we look at the API Snoop type of thing, that has a certain value, but it doesn't look introspect into the fields and talk about what different fields are being used for what different purpose. And so we need to generate this list of priorities, and we could just list them all in a spreadsheet, and that's fine. But it's not easily reviewed or approved. And if we're doing all that work anyway, it seems like putting it in a more machine readable format that can assist with the tooling is valuable.
John, one of the things that we're trying to explore was actually generating some YAML based on the usage from the Helm chart and the CNCFCI audit logs, so that we could see what those parameters are and kind of have a sort of and I don't know what, maybe you can help me with wording, whether they're kind or definitions, when those calls are made to the different object types within the API, so that we can have that prioritized list. I'm hoping to we'll be generating that YAML so everybody can use that within whatever methods we want to, but also providing that within a UI on the web so we can have that sorted. At the moment, arbitrarily, we need to figure out how to sort that list, but I would love to talk with you further on that.
Sure, yeah, we can discuss it. I mean, that would definitely give us a more concrete measure or some data about which things seem to be more commonly used. And so maybe which ones are priority, but I guess to like the discussion of, say, readiness probes or liveness probes, maybe all those Helm charts are using HTTP or exec. Does that mean we don't test TCP as part of conformance? I think we still need to, but I guess it's a lower priority.
I guess the question I had was, like, we're basically creating a lot of metadata. Would it be better to have a well-structured description for how we approach things? You're putting a tag. You're putting the quote-unquote tag, for lack of a better term, that we've defined inside of the end-to-end test that basically wraps behavior as if it were like a feature, right?
Well, I was putting that description you're talking about in a separate file. In a separate machine readable file. It's the description of all the tests and all the behaviors and the different areas that they're in, and potentially the different features they're associated with. And then when you write a test, you just create a tag referencing back to which of those behaviors this test validates. So there's already metadata around some other stuff. And so there is a sort of, there's pros and cons to separating these things out. And so that's a valid, I think, discussion. You can keep them all together and you can run some tooling to produce a similar list as another option. The thing I like is the separate. I think it's easy to sit down and go through the API guide and the docs and literally write out a structured list of all the behaviors. It's time consuming, but it's relatively easy to do. Whereas taking those one by one and building them into a test is much more effort. So my vision here is that we can sit down and nail out all those behaviors, and then we can start to match the test to them, and then we can answer that question of the pod spec, what percentage have we covered? which we have no way to answer right now without manually going through exactly the same procedure, essentially.
Okay, I understand, I think, in better context now of the approach you're trying to take. I did not glean that directly from reading the CAP a while ago.
Okay.
I think that is a worthwhile thing to do. The question, I think, is going to be bandwidth and who can do it.
Yeah. So I guess to start, I guess to move the CAP forward, I mean, we can continue this discussion on the CAP, and bandwidth and moving it forward. I can work on seeing if I can get some resources to help for that.
So here's a question that I have: is like, why can't we build this tooling directly in API Machinery today? Like API Machinery has all the metadata fields. Why can't we have API Machinery auto-generate this stuff?
We could actually. That is one of the, I think, alternatives listed there, and that works for a lot of things. And so it doesn't work for things like watch conformance for horizontals. It doesn't work for things that are horizontal across the service. So like how
But you could generate the single file. You could generate through API Machinery. That initial scope file.
For a lot of it, you probably can. Basically, in the same way we generate our schemas.
Yes.
Yeah. So I talked to Phil Whitlock about that, who's here, and so we can explore that some more too.
I think that would probably be the easiest one than trying to actually do it by hand, because that seems fraught with peril.
Yeah, I mean, it should be possible to tag all the features that are known to not be portable, like the Linux only features and cloud provider specific features and things like that.
In the metadata for the schema, you're saying?
On the actual API schema definitions.
Right.
Yeah.
Types.go files.
Yes.
Do those flow all the way through to the Open API spec and the Swagger JSON?
They can. We built all of that, all those generators.
Yeah.
That seems like in my opinion, that's the most automated approach, and also it makes the API the canonical source of truth, right? Instead of us having to like augment the tests themselves with this metadata.
Yeah, and so what that would give us is a list of features that are represented as fields of some API resource that should be covered by conformance. What it doesn't give is whether a given test, even if it exercises that feature, whether it actually validates the behavior of that feature or not.
Yeah, but it gives the list, and then we can take the list and say,
yes, it gives the list.
It gives the priority list. We could prioritize that list and give that.
Yeah, so more subtle behaviors like pod networking or watch semantics, things like that would not be covered, but definitely it would give us a pretty big starting point for the API service.
Let me, then I'll take some time and I'll revise the CAP to add that as at least the mechanism we used for API fields and for APIs, and then we can we'll still need an additional something to do it for watch and more holistic behaviors, but that'll be a good start.
Plus one for me. Any other questions, comments, complaints, concerns?
While we're talking about updating the Open API spec and Swagger JSON with this metadata to point to behaviors, we're currently referencing the tests by the string that gets generated during the Ginkgo test run. And in trying to instrument, a while back, I added some information to the HTTP user agent to identify where in the source code we were coming from. In trying to link together where that test is within the source code base to as the names change over time, as tags are added and removed, it'd be nice to have a canonical way to say this test in this piece of code so we can identify the changes. So when we're talking about what's happened since last week, what's changed, we can actually see the diff in just the set of functions around that test and reference it. That would be, I don't know if that would be useful. I feel it would be useful. but I don't know how to identify that and generate it somewhere.
So are you talking about, so I think I'm not clear, if we're doing this through the API schema, there's certainly you can, API changes are pretty tightly controlled. But if you're talking about, I guess I'm not clear on changes in tests wouldn't be reflected in the API schema. The API schema would only.
Of course not. I just meant, because right now I think we generate a text file, and the text file is the name of that test as it looks in the, and as far as automating the tooling to not just reference that name because it changes over time, but which source code file and function, at least the entry point. So we have a tight coupling between the which test is this and where is it in the code base, and as those functions change over time, just speaking quickly, how is this test changed as we tie them. Go ahead.
I care way more about routing behavior because like the description tag that John was mentioning, I think is far more important to me as a person who's trying to evaluate a failed test run, is that I want to know because it's not very intuitive sometimes from the strings, so I don't really care what the source code is because I can figure it out. What I care about is what are we actually trying to test, because the description itself doesn't encompass all of the behavior, what I'm trying to look for. So what I'm looking for is what were you really testing? Why were you testing it, and why did it fail? Because that's the most common feedback we get from the wild is like, we have no idea what this test is doing. The most common feedback we get from 90% of people is that DNS is terrible. So we should all know this. And that 2 is that they don't understand what test, how do I figure out what this test is actually doing and fix it?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're getting at is is there some way to more explicitly tie that test back to the behavior failure, maybe, and then find that test within the source code? And I think we can consider how we might do that linkage a little bit better than we do today.
That could be part of the KEP too. We could also refine that aspect of the KEP. If we're going to make changes, we should probably roll up the discovery feature into that.
Yeah.
Any other question, comments, complaints, concerns regarding the proposal? Going once, twice, 3 times. All right. Next up, we had the behavioral expiration. We kind of talked about that above. Do we want to go through that again?
Just making sure there's not any feedback on is stable Helm chart generation the way to go? What about operators.io? What sources, how can we currently identify what our user base is for what's important? And prioritizing those sources before I go dig into them might be nice, just as feedback from this team. Current sorted list for me is go get stable Helm charts, explore whether the operators.io has some type of sorting, because there's heaps of them there, and then cncf.ci has those projects, and I'm going to try to work with that team to get their audit logs.
Helm chart seems reasonable. Operators seems like a very niche case for what I know about the community and sort of the state of the market. I do think you'll get data there. I just don't think it'll be your average consumer.
Are there any stats on the Helm charts of how frequently they're used? I mean,
I tried for a while to work with the Helm project is passed through several people. And the buckets themselves, the BigQuery buckets for the popularity, I had a lot of trouble trying to generate the what was most heavily downloaded. If somebody wants to take a second look at that, or maybe pair with me on it, that would be a good source. And I have all of the information in the buckets, but my queries came back like every 15 minutes, I just get a count of what happened every 15 minutes, and it wasn't super useful data.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only thing about this overall approach, I don't know if there's any other way to get a signal, is that most of what people are doing is going to be internal, and we're not going to be able to have any visibility into it. So the Helm charts are sort of an indicator.
I've thought about that heavily as well, and I've thought about the same way that we use the Heptio or the VMware Sonobuoy, right? Where you can go to the Sonobuoy site and say, yes, I'd like to see if I'm conformant, and you pass that. Being able to go to API Snoop and say, I'd like to do a new thing and either upload my audit logs or run it internally, so they don't upload the specifics, but then upload the generated data, the summary, so they can say, here's what we use heavily, and here's a public URL. We can go say, we'd like this URL. It can be anonymized or whatever, but this is what we'd like to prioritize.
Yeah, you could do that. You can also actually look at the resources that exist in their cluster at a point in time, but and see what they're using. That kind of gets to another point that probably we shouldn't really talk about now, but I just wanted to throw out there, is that another step after we get some of these server conformance things resolved would be to have something that can look at your manifest when you want to deploy an application and identify if everything you're doing there is conformant, is portable rather, to as much extent of it as it can be.
There are people that use Kubernetes in a very limited fashion on a very regular basis. I think what might be interesting too is to do a poll. Like if you're doing 1 and 2, Helm charts is like the anonymous data that you could potentially get. But having a actual poll from the community about like what resources they use most, what things do they think lack in test coverage, just actually creating a structured way for evaluation so that way we can actually get raw customer or user feedback. We did this with SIG cluster lifecycle, and it gave us great signal that we use to shape how we're approaching the next iterations of things, because that gives us the actual feedback from the wild.
Did you do that in an automated fashion or some type of something they would run and upload, or how did that work?
No, we crafted as part of the release. Like, so when the 1.13 release went out, we did a big push to GA for Kubedian. We curated amongst all the leads of the project or sub-project, we curated a, what's it called? A survey. And from that survey data, it gave us very interesting insights of how people are using Kubernetes, how they're deploying Kubernetes, what features they want the most, what features they use the most. And it was basically raw, undistilled feedback. And we got about, what was the total number, Lubomir?
Something like 170 people.
Yeah, which is pretty reasonable. So that might be a worthwhile effort to potentially pursue, is the idea of a survey, a crafted survey about what aspects of Kubernetes you use the most, because that will give you the indirect measurement of what API coverage matters most. My supposition is deployments, which will filter through to pods and everything else. Are there any other questions, comments regarding this topic? All right. Conformance document should be part of release. I saw this PR. I don't know who put this on the list. Was that
you? Basically, I want it's not just that enhancement request, but generally we are not generating the documents. The last document in CNCF website is 1.11. So this enhancement is to auto-generate as part of the release Tarwal. We should Actually, what I'm saying is we should put that under radar, maybe because we need to generate the document, either manually or as part of the release. So just wanted to bring it up.
I've always wondered why we haven't just auto-generated and pushed into docs, so that way when a person does a search for here's the most common scenario I see in the wild. Something failed and they want to figure out why, and then they go to a certain set of Slack channels and ask the same question 5 different times, right? And I think optimizing that user story of saying like, I want to Google search why this failed, boom, it punches to a web page that documents and outlines what this test is doing. And here's the actual data. And here's where you can go find more. If it's part of the release tarball, that might help some people, but that doesn't actually give the end user community or the distributors the ability to find and search and hunt to figure out what is this failure and why, what are some ways to diagnose the problem?
Yeah, so the metadata associated with the test, if I hear it correctly, is going to give the end user some direction how to debug the problem if the test fails, right? So yeah, you can probably respond to that enhancement request and say, I propose that it should be part of the release docs under conformance, but it can live anywhere. I mean, once the KEP is approved, I think I can even try to push a PR to get this maybe part of 115 or whatnot. So I can work on it. I think that is important.
Are there any other comments there? I can just put that comment in the cap. I don't necessarily know if it needs to, KEPs are broader awareness of things that cross SIGs and our features. For this, it's uncontroversial to me to just have it be a PR that's auto-generated as part of the docs. I don't know if we need formalization for this level of effort. Brian, do you have thoughts there?
If that is the case, I'm pretty fine. I mean, basically, I can push a PR out and we can close this. Yeah. I just thought.
Sorry, I was multiplexing.
So the question is, we're talking about should we release the metadata as part of the release? And I said, why isn't it just part of the doc site? So when anybody Google searches, they can find the conformance test and all the metadata. So if a person fails a test, they just do a Google search and they find it immediately.
Right, or both. I can imagine it being part of the release notes or some appendix to the release notes with the release. And the docs are also versioned by release, so it could make sense to put it both places.
Sure. The question that I had was, I personally don't think this is something that rises to KEP level feature that cuts across multiple SIGs, or it would even be major announcements. It seems like what I want to make sure we're doing is KEPs are meant to raise the bar for feature enhancements so that we have broader signal and coverage. This just seems like this is a no-brainer. We don't need so much process to be burdensome in the way. Just go ahead and do it. I don't have a problem with it. What are your thoughts there? That was the question.
Yeah, I mean, we're creating KEPs for more and more things. If there's any discussion needed, even within a SIG, about the design or whether or not we should do it. And this particular thing, I think, is on the edge. If you just did something and showed people and they said, sure, that looks good, you could just merge it. If not, then we can go back and discuss in the KEP. I'd be fine with that.
Okay. Does that work for you, Srini?
Yeah, that works.
Right. Last was to go through the board. We are at T-minus 9 minutes, so I just want to give a brief update of some things. I'll share my screen really quickly.
As we do this, one question I had is, a difference between in progress and in review. So there's a
And we actually had that comment last time. I said I wanted to get rid of the in progress column, but I was pushed back against. I think there are.
So I mean, where it comes up is right. I was reviewing a bunch, and then of course I said, "Hey, this needs to change. This needs to change." Does that belong in review, or does it belong in progress? Like, what is it?
So, yeah, in my opinion about that is, I guess, twofold. One is if it's a test and it's WIP or something like that, it would be in progress, like not ready for review yet. And then, or if it's something we're actually building, it might be an issue that's in the in progress column rather than a PR. And then when it's ready for review, it would move to the in review column. If it's in review, yeah, put it in the in review column.
Okay.
I would question, anything that's labeled WIP probably should not be WIP if it's in review.
Okay, so basically, if you pull something off the backlog and you're just saying, I'm working on this, so nobody else will pull it off the backlog. You throw it in progress. Once it's ready for review, even though there's changes made throughout review, it stays in review until.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, you were out, John, but we had this exact conversation.
Okay.
I had the same point.
Watch the video, I guess.
Yeah. So just to give a brief update, so part of what we want to do is make sure that we're tracking progress. There are currently 5 that need approval. I do believe that everyone else has LGTM'd those items in. There were several assigned to you, John. Do you want me to punt the networking ones to you? Because there's, I believe, one networking one that's currently.
Yeah, I went through most of these today and yesterday, and one of them I moved to needs approval, and then a number of them are kind of waiting on updates from the authors for various reasons. Yeah, but any networking ones for sure I can take care of, and go from there after that.
Okay. There's a couple that are marked as in progress but don't have reviewers. Are there folks that want to sign up for with a no exec taint? I think I should probably actually do this one because I've already commented on the other one. I think Aaron's already looking at this too.
Been updating it during the meeting.
What?
I see Aaron's working on some of our conformance stuff. I see the Kate's conformance channel.
I think the sort of backlog was clear. The in triage column, I think Srini with that bot, that would help a lot. There's a couple of new PRs that look like they've been put up recently. Are there folks who would like to help review some PRs?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to review some.
I think. So let's take a real quick look at priority here. Important long-term by somebody else. I'll just leave it like that. New E2E proposal. This is interesting. Validate all the pods are removed. The job is deleted. It says important soon. I don't think it is important soon. Does anyone want to look at this one?
I'll take a look at it.
Let's see if I can get your handle right this time.
Yeah, VRAH. Sorry. Yeah.
I'll get it right one of these days.
I'll take a look at the needs approval column.
Okay.
So that node conformance one, a lot of those really are not able to be conformed, be conformance, because they're testing all kinds of low-level kubelet things that really shouldn't be there. But why don't you go ahead and sign that to me if I'm not already assigned on it? And
There's been a bunch of PRs that have already flowed through it. I don't know when they're going to be done, though. So this is actually an issue. So I do know that they made a bunch of changes already.
Okay.
But I don't know if they are done for the time being.
I mean, some of those even check like log entries, which is, you know, of kubelet log entries, which is crazy. So.
Yep.
In general, node conformance, I think, not to bring up a whole other topic, but the validation, that should probably be some sort of validation suite as opposed to having the word conformance, just to avoid confusion.
Yeah, there is a doc PR that might even still be open that maybe we should finish reviewing and make sure it gets merged if it's not merged already.
Yeah,
That was
not merged.
The validation suite.
That was from Brad.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that's the one which Dim reviewed last week, and I think Brad addressed all the questions. It's in the in review. So
Okay, so let's try to get that merged. I have to run to my next meeting,
okay.
but if there's anything else, somebody let me know. John sits right behind me, so he can let me know.
Yeah, Tim, this came up in one of the cluster lifecycle, cluster API meetings, is the idea of conforming cluster API, but really it should be validating. We should validate the cluster API providers against cluster API, not conformance. So I just want to be sure people are using the right word.
Yes, that's a fair statement, and I think having the proper ontologies or taxonomy is important.
Yeah.
We are out of time. We've got one more here. Somebody want to take a look at it? Promote E2E check. Promote existing E2E check pod toleration for no executing. This looks like another one that should probably be on me. Never mind. All right, I think we are out of time. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
And if you're at KubeCon EU, we'll see you there.
Oh, yeah, are we going to have any kind of conformance meetup or anything, discussion? Did we have a session or anything?
I don't know yet. We should probably take that to both SIGARCH and the CNCF list and see.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Thanks.